So the first one we're going to talk about is agriculture and salinization. Okay. Salinization is the idea where the ground becomes oversaturated with salt. So over time, as you flood your agricultural land to wash off stuff like that, pollutants and other chemicals and maybe fertilizer, you know, during the Nile River especially, these rivers flood like crazy, like clockwork. It washes out, it rejuvenates the land, it leaves stuff behind for new growth and new nutrients. And then every year, the Nile River, especially the Nile, but others in Southwest Asia here, others would flood just the same way. Well, when humans started putting dams on these rivers, the flood stopped, because part of making a dam is about flood control to save lives and stuff. Well, that hurt a lot of the farmers. So the farmers, instead of having normal floods, then now they have to use fertilizers, which are expensive. And also, if you're bringing agricultural water, irrigation onto your land all the time, that water seeps into the ground, it's evaporated, it's used by your plants, and the minerals are left behind. Those minerals, like salt, are very damaging to the prospects and the prosperity of that soil. So salinization is the idea where over time, your fields become salt laden and they are no longer productive and you can't do anything about it. Okay, that's sub-Saharan Africa. I want the next one, Southwest Asia, North Africa. Okay, I have a couple slides on there, including water issues of Southwest Asia and North Africa. Okay, that's that one there. But yeah, this is a really good section if you want to look at, there's a lot of pictures obviously, but water is life. A lot of issues that could lead to conflict in Southwest Asia and North Africa. Okay, it's a big, big deal. Let's see if this is over here, so if I added anything in there to that. I'll find it right here, salinization. Nope, not even there. Okay, good. So we'll have to go from there. All right, the ones that I posted here. Water is the big issue, okay, in the future, especially in Southwest Asia, North Africa, where, as you saw in chapter 7, it was really, really dry. Okay. You'd see global water stresses, especially in the areas that are getting drier, like the Sahara Desert region. Water withdrawal percentage total available, so there's not much water left down below. It's below ground. Water issues could lead to problems in the West Bank, which is Palestine, Israel, stuff like that. Desertification is something you probably read about last chapter. It's about ecological changes, maybe some human issues there that turn somewhat marginal land into desert land, overgrazing, soil erosion, things like that. So that's usually in the Sahel region, as we talked about in the first chapter.
What is that? West Virginia becomes a desert once a year.
Oh yeah, the size of West Virginia, like the state itself, an area that size becomes desertified every year.
Ah, got it.
Somewhere over, I mean, you could add them all up. So here in Australia, in Patagonia, in Niger, and Chad, all that land area together is one West Virginia.
Okay, I just read that wrong.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, one West Virginia gets a desert every year. That's kind of cool. But yeah, what one size of West Virginia becomes desert? So it's a good question. So, some of these areas right now, when we're in this time, this is a very dry region. But if you go back a couple thousand years, large land mammals lived in these dry deserts, which could tell you that it was wetter at one time. Okay, you can see this river valley. This just looks like Hesperia almost, and Lucerne Valley.
That's what I was thinking. It could very easily be the Mojave.
Yeah, it's right here in the Mojave. It looks very similar. And this used to be a big river, just like the Mojave River used to be a pretty darn big river. The climate changes and people move and animals migrate. So the problem is now that we have all these people living in these areas, people can't migrate easily anymore. Right? You're now have these borders, these state borders where people can't move back and forth across. And as we've seen in places like Libya and Syria, Tunisia for a little while, Egypt especially, we're seeing a lot of people on the margins because their water's running out, their land is being salinated, they're having all sorts of problems. And the government doesn't listen to them, so they try and overrule that. So please, the question for this essay section is, please explain how agricultural practices have increased the occurrence of salinization on the land in this region. Okay, so salinization is the idea that the water you bring on, the irrigated water, gets evaporated and leaves behind all these minerals. Those minerals will turn into salt. When you evaporate water, salt is left behind and other minerals, but salt's a bad one, especially when you're trying to do agriculture. Okay, you can see here most of the people in Egypt. Where is that? Right there. Most of the people in Egypt and Chad actually live along the river. You can see the population is almost nil outside the river valley, and you can see Egypt is mostly like 95, 98% within 100 miles of the Nile River. So if that river dries up, then those people have to go somewhere else, and they can't. That's a big problem. So the salinization, think about irrigation, now fertilizer, lack of annual floods that used to happen, especially on the Nile River, the high cost of fertilizer, and then your land gets overused. You have so many people, so you can't rotate your crops anymore. There's so many people shoved in along that river, so you're up against it, and your ground starts getting salinated, and you can't grow anything anymore. It's a big problem. Okay. All right, questions with that one? And I'll show you pictures of some irrigating water here. So this is the Nile River. They got one of those old water wheels that sucks up water, and that water then fills in all the low-lying valley to where you can have agriculture, sort of like here in Southern California, Imperial Valley. You can see some of these pumps are through animal husbandry. Some of them people are just throwing the water themselves from one side to the other. And then of course, people need to drink this water. And you can see what a lush environment it creates from the river itself going outward. It gets drier and drier as it's harder and harder to bring that water to the landscape. Then finally, it hits the large city of Cairo, where you have huge tall buildings, hotels everywhere, monuments, museums, colleges, mosques, businesses, hotels, everything. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge city. So that's where the Nile would go then, I guess. Okay, so that's that first question. All right, another question which the textbook does cover is discuss the reasons for building dams and their environmental effects. Okay, there's pros and cons to dam building, and use one of the examples we see here, either in this slideshow, which is water is life, or the textbook slideshow talking about dam building and changing of environments. Okay. So, devastation in Iraq, Syria. all sorts of, well, that's human stuff. Humans cause a lot of these problems, by the way. So let's go into one of these areas as an example of what dams are good and bad for. Okay, so let's go back to, where is it, right here, Fertile Crescent. Okay, so dam building is a way that you will capture the river water that's going past you in order to either control flooding so no one in your town, your country dies, or to hold that water back so you could use it to run down a pipe and make electricity through friction, you know, turning turbines and producing electricity. So it's a double-edged sword. It gives you positive both in terms of producing free, cheap electricity, and then not killing your residents because it doesn't flood. Okay, but you could use these dams for nefarious ways too. Okay, so we're going to take an example of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. Okay, the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, they're really famous. They're part of this Fertile Crescent, this history of quote unquote the Middle East, Southwest Asia. And the way I like to remember these two rivers are that the Euphrates River, which is the one closer to Europe, is on the left side. Okay, the Euphrates, Euphrates, the Euphrates River, is the river that's closer to Europe, which is over here to the west. Okay, that's the one that goes through Western Iraq into Syria and starts up in the highlands of Turkey. Okay, the second major river here is called the Tigris, Tigris, the Tigris River, and that's the one that goes through Baghdad all the way through Mosul, again forming in the highlands of southwest Turkey. Okay, so these are the two big famous dams, and the land between those, I mean the two big famous rivers, the land between those rivers is called Mesopotamia, or the land between the rivers. Meso, between, right? So this is Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers. Part of this Fertile Crescent in terms of the crescent of civilization, or Western civilization, maybe early civilization period, but also you can see all these sites of ancient settlements all through here. So you had actually a little higher elevation, a little cooler, maybe a little wetter. So you had a larger amount of people being able to live there instead of this dry desert we see today. Okay, so what would happen if you build a dam? Okay, so let's start off with the Euphrates River. Okay, the Euphrates River starts in the southeast area of Turkey. It goes down through Syria, providing almost all of its water for the country of Syria, and then it crosses through a huge desert, as some of us might know, and then all the way through Iraq, all the way out to the Basra. I forget the name of that thing. It's like where the two rivers converge right by the Persian Gulf. Okay, so if Turkey wants to develop their wild mountainous areas, they actually went to the Tennessee Valley Authority in Tennessee, the United States. They went to Knoxville, Tennessee, Chattanooga, Tennessee, to the headquarters of the Tennessee Valley Authority. They went there to find out what they could do to create a strong economy, how to best capture the water and provide electricity and flood control for the residents. So instead of building one giant dam like China did, Turkey decided to build one big dam and a whole bunch of other smaller dams. Okay, and you can see here, this is one of the dams, probably the Ataturk Dam, I'm assuming. It's huge. Okay, where we go? Stop moving. There we go. Okay, so Turkey, in order to create recreation for its people, to provide electricity and flood control for its people, they dammed up the Euphrates River. Okay, the biggest one being something called the Ataturk Dam, which is one of their famous presidents. Okay, and they built a couple of other ones here. But what they're doing, you can see how much water they're trapping here. They're trapping all this water. And what does that do to Syria? Okay, Francis, Matthew, do you have any idea of what happens if you trap all the water?
I would say it would limit Syria's access to that water, preventing them from using it for them.
That's exactly right. And what happens if 90% of your water comes from the Euphrates River? Francis, what do you think? If 90% of your drinking water and agricultural water that you use for your whole country comes from the Euphrates River, what happens if Turkey cuts off that water, Francis?
Then you have no water.
Then you have no water. Right? That's part of the reason we saw this huge Syria uprising in the last decade. Part of the reason. You had climate changing, which baked the area, which stopped dropping rainfall. You had this crazy tyrant trying to get different ethnic groups against each other. And then you had your enemy, Turkey, cutting off water to you. So you put yourself in a really bad situation, and no wonder people left like crazy. There's the city of Aleppo. Why people just, refugees pouring out of Syria because they were done. There's no water, there's no life there. Okay. What happens if Turkey went to war with Syria? Can they put some biological pathogens in the water and send it down through Syria?
Absolutely. They could really.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if most of your population is living along with that water, they're in trouble, right? So they only have, and their other river is all the way on the other side of the country that Israel controls. They sort of fought over that land that controls that river there. So they're in a tough situation. So that's the Euphrates River to the west. Okay. Now the Tigris River is the river that's, again, starts in Turkey, but flows through Iraq mostly and all the way down to the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. Okay. You can see here, and again, this is a little old, these proposed dams and things like that. But you can see the Saddam Dam, Saddam Hussein Dam. They named them all after him. He's from this northern section here, and his religious group, his people in power, did not like the Sunni, the Shia Muslims to the south, which were mostly Iranian cultural groups. So in order to decimate his enemies, one of Saddam's plans was to dam up the rivers, which drained the swampland, which drained like the cultural hearth of his enemies to the south. And then those enemies were in a very perilous situation. They didn't have any food, they didn't have any water, they were starving, all because their enemy was controlling the water that flowed to them. Okay. So the question is, discuss the reasons for building dams and their environmental effects. So I've just talked about the political effects and the human effects, but the environmental effects could be, I'm changing this lush landscape into a desert, or maybe I'm poisoning my neighbors, or maybe now I have these huge lakes here where now I could bring in all sorts of people to have second homes and boats and marinas and jobs and strong economies on these lakes like we have in the United States. Okay. It also could dry up certain areas and put more moisture in the air at other areas to produce rainfall from evaporation. So discuss the pros and cons of both dam building and then use an example from one of these regions. So that's your second essay. All set with that, Francis? Matt, you all right with that?
Yep.
I'm good.
Okay, great. All right, the third example from this section, from again, Southwest Asia and North Africa section, is resource conflict. And it sort of goes in along what we just talked about with water. Okay. So natural resource conflict in North Africa, Southwest Asia. Please label and answer both sections fully for full credit. Part A, what are some reasons that can explain why shortages of natural resources might lead to countries might lead countries to war or inter-country conflict. Okay, so have you heard of anything in Southwest Asia or North Africa that deals with resources and conflict? Matt, Francis?
Still here.
Okay, have you heard of anything in Southwest Asia or North Africa where resources led to conflicts?
Yes, didn't, if I remember correctly, didn't, I believe Europe tried to colonize on their, I think, gold and diamond mines?
The Europeans after World War I, they split up. They split up the Ottoman Empire, and then they carved out their own areas to pull out resources, and they put some local people in charge. Yeah,
Okay.
that's after World War I. But how about today?
Resources, natural resources like diamonds.
Yeah. But did we find a lot of diamonds in this part of the world?
No, it's all about oil today.
Yeah, it's oil or what did we just talk about?
Water.
Or water.
Water, right? The name of this slideshow that I have, the name of this thing is called Water is Life. Okay. It's the idea where you can't live without water. Water is more important than oil because I can't drink oil, right? Oil won't feed my crops. Oil won't feed my animals, right? Now that'll turn into money to make it, but that's 2 or 3 steps further on. Okay. So you could have these resources, whether it's oil, as in the first Gulf War in 1990 and 1991, which lasted for a short period of time. The second Gulf War, which lasted for a very, very long time. You can have battles between Oman and Saudi Arabia. You could have battles between Egypt and Israel. Israel with all of their neighbors. Okay. It's not about just religion, it's about resources and land here. Okay, water is a big part of it. But there's a lot of resources. There's not much resources, a lot of people. So people want to keep and secure those resources. Like water is the big one, and oil or gas is the next big one. Okay, so we went to war. The United States have went to war in this region twice in less than 20, let's say now, in 30 years. 2 big wars in less than 30 years. Okay, just that's in Iraq and Kuwait only. Okay, but we've been fighting, not all of us have been fighting, but we have soldiers, men and women fighting, defending territory in Lebanon, in Syria, in Israel, Jordan, all over the place. Okay. And if they're not our soldiers, they're our equipment, our advisors, our people are still there. Okay. From your textbook, lecture, or recent history, this is now part B of that question about resources. From recent history, so 1990 onward, which is Gulf War I, George H.W. Bush. Please offer complete examples of at least 2 locations or instances where this could happen in Southwest Asia or North Africa in this region. Be specific about what type of resources you are discussing, where this is, and some possible outcomes. And can you relate this to anything that we see here in the United States? Okay, so do we have water and gas problems and fights in the United States?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole state of California is a big water war, isn't it?
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, Francis, we're taking water from other parts of other states to provide water for our population in Southern California, right?
Right, right.
So what if we weren't states? What if Arizona and Nevada were different countries? And that's what's happening in other places. We're taking water from other countries, other states, that if you were in Southwest Asia, it'd be fighting terms, right?
through. I think here in California, I think we get a lot of our water from the Colorado River, I think.
We get it from the Colorado River, and where we live, we get a lot of it from upstate, from Owens Valley and from the Delta up in what's the name of it? San Joaquin Valley, the San Joaquin Valley up there. They pump water down this way as well. So we get it from all over the place. And I think Victorville mostly gets it from the mountains and also from Northern California, I think. I know that big aqueduct goes right through Hesperia and Victorville out west. So anyway, so we have this also happens between the United States and Canada. I mean, I'm sorry, the United States and Mexico, where we take all this water out of the Colorado River, going to Phoenix, going to Flagstaff, going to Las Vegas, going to Southern California. And by the time it reaches the border of Mexico, then we also take it out and send it to the Imperial Valley, where the Salton Sea is. And we take the water and just ride it right along the border, and Mexico could sort of see it but can't use it. And the rest of the the rest of the Colorado River goes into Mexico, and Mexicali sucks up as much as they can, and then it doesn't even reach the ocean. So between two countries, we have agreements to let so much water of the Colorado flow into Mexico. But as Mexico grows, as the population grows, they're going to want more water. So and as the climate changes, we get drier and drier. So we're putting ourselves in a tough spot as well. Hopefully, we do have better relations between our friends Mexico and the United States than some of these states here in Southwest Asia and North Africa do. Okay. All right. So far, so good. So,
Yes.
okay. Those are the 3 essay questions from Chapter 7's material, which is Southwest Asia and North Africa. Let's see, that's Sub-Saharan Africa. And then finally, we'll do